So we're going to get started. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming to what I think potentially could be the most important panel here for a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons being very new reasons. And I'd like, obviously, particularly to thank the panelists that are here, Faye Ringel, David Nickle, Silvia Moreno-Garcia, Morgan Grefe, and Anthony. Of course, I'd like to apologize that, one thing you might first automatically notice is skin color. This is obviously part of the reason why we're having this panel and why I think this is an important panel, if not the important panel for the future of weird fiction. Before we get too much into me standing on a soapbox, because I feel like I have about 5 hours of things to gush out of my mind, I'd like to back up and first let everyone kind of introduce themselves on the panel, and then I want to sort of lay out generally what we'd like to talk about. Obviously, Lovecraft racism, what that significance is to the weird community, to all of us as fans, or at least people that enjoy Lovecraft to one extent or another, or just weird fiction in general. And then obviously, of course, we should spend some time kind of putting some of that racism in context for what it's worth, even though that's an unfortunately more perilous path than it really should be. But anyway, so start with Faye.
I'm Faye Ringel. I'm a retired professor at the Coast Guard Academy in London, and I've been a Lovecraft fan for a very, very long time.
I'm David Nickle. I'm an author and journalist. The relevance, I guess, from being on this panel, which thank you for asking me to do that, is a few years ago wrote a novel called Utopia, a novel of terrible optimism, which is a Lovecraftian theme novel, I guess, that tries to deal directly with this racism through the early American eugenics movement. And last, about a year ago today, actually, I wrote a blog post that got a bit of attention through going in other places about the difficulty that I have had in 2013 just talking about this at panels on Lovecraft. Since then, it seems to have become remarkably easier to talk about this on panels about Lovecraft, but not necessarily more comfortable.
Hi, I'm Silvia Moreno-Garcia. I live in Canada. Originally, I'm from Mexico. I moved there 10 years ago, so we are Canadian friends. Writer and editor, but I think the reason why I'm on this panel specifically is because my master's degree work right now, my thesis is on eugenics, women, and Lovecraft. So I'm very familiar with the late 19th century sciences and the early 20th century biological sciences.
I'm Morgan Grefe. I'm the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Historical Society. My background, however, is in African American history and the history of race and immigration in the United States, and the history of the United States prisons, the current apartheid state of American prisons. So I believe I'm the one that's here not as a Lovecraft person much at all, but more as someone who specializes in this as a historian.
My name is Leman. I'm with the HP Lovecraft Historical Society, which, although it has a very grand name, is a fundamentally frivolous institution. We do adaptations of Lovecraft stories in movies and radio shows, and we often have to grapple with the issue of how do we deal with the obvious fact of Lovecraft's racism when trying to adapt some of his stories for popular consumption in this day and age.
All right, and I'm Niels Hobbs. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the organizer for Necronomicon Providence. And thank you very much. And I come to Lovecraft not so much as a fan, though I am in many ways really a great admirer of his literary work, and obviously I think certainly the large majority of us are. I'm sorry that I'm kind of actually going to bleed this into the overall panel. Actually, like I said, I don't count myself really as a fan of him, really, or even his work, but I do give a tremendous amount of credit to, I think, the important positive things that he's done. And to me, he's actually a fascinating person, personally, largely probably because of his flaws, some of his flaws being incredibly ugly flaws. But I think we can all acknowledge that humans are often very flawed and sometimes very ugly people. And yet there can still be aspects of them that are remarkable and positive and worth enjoying and embracing. So I want this panel to kind of be a place where we can just talk openly and honestly without sweeping anything under the rug. And accept that, hey, if we're here, it's probably because we enjoy Lovecraft. And I hope you can all accept the fact that some of the things that we're probably going to say on this panel may not be things you completely agree with. We may not all agree amongst ourselves, but I do want to lay down the one fundamental thing that is truly undeniable, and that is that Lovecraft was a racist. Whether he was a product of his time, as is often put out, and certainly there's a good argument to be made for that, whether he modified his views over time, and he certainly was capable of showing some capacity for change, whether he did or not is arguable. Those are all things that I don't think we need to necessarily hash out entirely. I don't think they're entirely productive. But I think it's important for us to face that fact, and there are people that either don't want to admit it or want to avoid it because it's unpleasant, and it's absolutely unpleasant, but sometimes we need to face those things in order to positively move forward. And if there's ever going to be another Necronomicon, if there's going to be a good, positive future for weird fiction, which is born from Lovecraft, I think we need to embrace these things and talk about them and move forward, see how we can use them to grow and actually make a positive, diverse, active community that still acknowledges Lovecraft as one of the people that started it and contributed to it and is a fundamental player in it. And I don't think you need both. I don't think you need to reject Lovecraft as a racist and still be able to enjoy his fiction. Well, hopefully you can understand what I was trying to say. Anyway, maybe the wine is already kicking in. And I'm sorry my thoughts are a little bit scattered. I've been kind of being bombarded all day by a lot of kind of blowback from the things that happened at the First Baptist Church on Thursday night, which for those of you who were there, I actually really want to personally apologize to you for some of the things that were said that I am deeply hurt by, actually, myself. And they are absolutely not things that are things that we believe as organizers by any means. And it's not the kind of community that we want to have as people that want to be a nexus point for everybody that's interested in weird fiction and people that enjoy Lovecraft of all backgrounds. So please accept our apology for that. Obviously, I'm not truly going to apologize for the words of one person who I think represents a view that still is out there, clearly. And I think if I can thank Bob Price for one thing, I will thank him for this, for laying it out there that this is still an issue in this country. Obviously, I don't think any of us, if we even remotely watch the news, can avoid the fact that racism is a problem in this country right now. And for people to try to ignore Lovecraft's racism 75 years ago is odd considering how overt racism is today. So I want to kind of lay that out there and then back up. I just want to have that as the framework, and I'm sorry that this is even, I would like this panel to be a little bit more of a positive discussion of a negative topic, but I have to put that out there. Anyway, so with that in mind, I would like to start off, first let's go back and talk about Lovecraft's racism and think about its place in time. And I know, I'm sure all the people on the panel are going to have different opinions, possibly. I think that there should be hopefully enough overlap. So I don't know if there's any people in particular that, Morgan, you might actually probably be the best person to start off. Sort of putting in context, for those of you who didn't see Morgan's academic talk yesterday, I'm sorry, unfortunately I had to miss it, but I think it was an incredibly important piece to really sort of lay the groundwork for American history. Not just a story about Lovecraft, but American history, and some of the aspects that we sometimes choose not to be aware of. But anyway, so Morgan, can you start us at all with some context a little bit?
Sure. And again, as Niels pointed out in the beginning of his talk, when we talk about context, it's important to understand that in no way is that sort of sitting here making any excuses for anyone or exonerating anyone's actions or beliefs because of a certain time. But at the same time, there are huge misconceptions about race, racism, and those concepts, race in particular as a social construct that was a changing target throughout the centuries and still is in many ways. And in this period in which Lovecraft is born and in which he begins his sort of scientific and writing career, I think it's important to think about the role of scientific racism and the ways in which race is being moved out of this sort of social construct in parlance and really being put into a definitive sense of this is science. There are many things now even which, we have competing sciences in many ways. And so there was, however, this is a big thrust, 1890s, 1900, moments of progress. The turn of that century was around issues of progress and about the promise of science, particularly medical science, and this ties right into racial sciences. And many people here on this panel are experts in eugenics, and that, of course, is a big part of that and a lot of what we talked about yesterday. But it's also, I think, important to think about the kind of racism that was going on, which is the overt sort of racial violence that is, in many ways, reaching its height in 1890 and 1900 towards African Americans in particular. So when we think about things like the history of lynching, we look at the 1890s and to 1900 as really being the incredible kind of growth point where in the 19th century, lynching deaths on African Americans hovered around 40%. By the 1890s, it goes up to 89%. And you have from 1890 to the 1930s, 3,000 African Americans lynched. And so there's an incredible amount of extra-legal violence that is going on. And as lynching becomes more heavily policed and comes into the federal landscape, you have an increase, you might have a decrease in deaths, but you have an increase of violence against the body. One of the other points that I think is really important is the role of academics in this sort of movement. And these are leading scholars and politicians, presidents of universities, Stanford University in particular, leading the way in eugenics. President Woodrow Wilson, when he was president of Princeton, saying some incredibly deplorable things, bring segregation back to Washington, D.C. And so this is a really accepted, and in fact, when you reference sort of the leading thought thinkers of this period, this is what they're espousing. And the progressive movement wraps that in sort of with the eugenics movement. But we see many universities struggling with this through the 1920s. Harvard, 1924, there's a big controversy over housing in Harvard, the dormitory scandal, where African-American men are let into the university but barred from living there. And that's happening in other universities around as well. So this isn't, what I try to talk about is we don't want to ever make these things a Southern problem. We don't want to make it a working class problem. This is an American problem, and in many ways still is. And so just so we can kind of think about what's going on at that period and to keep in mind the incredible kind of vastly changing and quickly changing demographics of America at that time, and especially East Coast cities. And so this is a period of incredible immigration, and percentage-wise, New York and Providence are about the same percentage of foreign-born. Providence is 34, New York is 38. Sheer numbers, of course, New York has a lot more people. But we are seeing Providence is also very wealthy. Providence is wealthier than New York. And so there is not the same loss of jobs that people are experiencing in New York when we think about Lovecraft, in sort of near starvation in New York, in the horror of New York, which, it's New York. But Providence is a much smaller and more contained space that he knows better. But it's, I think, very important to understand that the Providence that he's growing up in is the 4th busiest immigration port in the nation. And it also, in 1900, Rhode Island is the most heavily foreign-born and first generation of any state in the country. And so we are nearly 70% first generation and foreign-born here in Rhode Island. So it's a really interesting moment and very much a changing America.
Does anyone else have any background thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was looking into to sort of research this panel was, and I think in light of all of that actual information, an important thing to remember is that Lovecraft himself brought very little demographic information or understanding to his critique of the immigration percentages and whatnot. He admitted at various points in letters to saying that, yeah, he never really went very far into Red Book because he was terrified of it. He made it up. He presumed all of that. He presumed that his neighbors in rooming houses were foul-smelling Syrians. He never faced them because he was terrified. He was writing his neuroses. And I think one of the things that is potentially so toxic with Lovecraft racism is that his notions and his warnings, which I think probably inform some of the talk on Thursday night, are as imaginary as non-Euclidean geometry in a South Sea island. He just made it up, and it's this compelling fantasy of terror of the other that he has created, and particularly through his letters, almost made a manifesto about it. And it's more bullshit than most.
But if you've ever, of course, read any of the Vermont set stories, things like The Whisperer in Darkness, the true horror in the hills of Vermont was Vermont's eugenics project, which went further than any other state towards mandating sterilization. And Vermont, talk about making things up, Vermont had no foreign-born. They turned their sterilization on the descendants of their own inbred families and the very few Abenaki and other Native Americans. But they were infected with this idea of racial taint and the need to purify the strain. Vermont's eugenics laws were put into force in 1927, not 1897, but just as he was writing The Whisperer in Darkness.
So I think I'll talk a little bit about post-colonialism and the construction of the white male ideal for a little bit here. And so one thing that happens during this time period, around the time period when Lovecraft is born and is writing, is that that's really, there's the big era of the post-colonial empire and scientific colonial science. So that's when people from France and from Great Britain are going to Africa and they are figuring out ways to take over the territory and better oppress the natives. So a lot of the research that is being done, geographical surveys and ways to not get sick with things like malaria and things like that, are ways so that white people can, conquer this area rich in resources. Because if you send your whole army and 90% of them die of some local parasite or something like that, you can't conquer very well. And when people set out to do that late in the 1800s, they're very optimistic that science and white man will triumph, because obviously, white man is at the pinnacle of evolution. He is superior, so he will go there, and he will conquer the natives, he will conquer the land, and everything will be okay. Now, what happens later on in the 1900s is that many of these projects fail in one way or the other. I mean, the story of Panama is like just people dying on top of the other, and same things in Africa. Things don't quite go always the way the white male colonizers expect them to go. They need resistance, both biological and other times geographical. The territory is just not, it's unwieldy and all that kind of stuff. And so I think there's a moment of disenchantment there in general for certain members of the elite, of these white elite members, who where they realize that even though they're supposed to be the top of the food chain, they're not doing very well. They're not able to overtake these lands and these people and these animals in the way that they plan. I mean, if you are the fittest, why are you dying of malaria in the middle of a jungle? And I think Lovecraft has that same preoccupation that runs through society of why is this happening? Why are we not, being able to triumph the way we want it in himself, right? It's like, why, if he is so white, New England, upper crust gentleman, is he not doing well financially? Why, is it that these hordes of immigrants are somehow managing to thrive and take over, and he, who should be at the top of the food chain, is at the bottom of the food chain eating expired cans of beans. So I think he's expressing in a micro way this big anxiety that people are seeing, and also when immigrants come, a lot of the populations are doing okay. They're establishing neighborhoods, and it's not that den of sin that Lovecraft really imagines. You have shops, you have a culture, and they're doing okay, they're flourishing. And of course, if you're not flourishing, you look and you say, you feel very angry, right? Why are they doing okay? This was my God-given right. And so they must be taking it away in some way or the other. And Lovecraft, I think, that's one of the things that's going on with him. He's very upset about that, but it's not a unique frustration. I think it's a frustration that is occurring with a number of, and it's mostly men, really, white men in society.
Not yet.
All right. Well, so I think it's important now to interject a couple things that I'd like to point out. For one, obviously, so if you all, I'm sure, read the title of this panel, and the second part of it is moving past the Howies. That's obviously a reference to the whole debacle over the WFA award, which I think we should get into a little bit. But the truly sad thing for me as somebody who organized the Economicon 2013. And then very soon after that, even though it had already been percolating for a while, very soon after that, things really blew up around the Howies, the controversy of that. For those of you who maybe possibly doubt Lovecraft's racism, there's that one particular poem, which if you haven't read that one particular poem, you should read it. I think all Lovecraft fans, all people who enjoy Lovecraft should probably read this awful, awful poem at some point. Just so you know, the thing is, here's the important thing. It doesn't mean you are not allowed to enjoy Lovecraft stories after that. You are. You can. I've read Lovecraft stories after reading that poem, and I still enjoyed them just as much. And I think they're still just as important literary in their contribution to this literary genre than they were before I read that poem. Likewise, here's my problem with the WFA before we kind of back up a little bit. I want this just to be in the back of your minds.
It's the World Fantasy.
The World Fantasy Award, sorry, for those of you who aren't, which, the award itself is fashioned after sort of a grotesque depiction of Lovecraft. And the problem that came out of it was very quickly, and a lot of this is because of the beauty of social media, where all of a sudden either you're far over on this side or you're incredibly far over on that side of the story. And there's no room for any discussion in the middle. It's like no man's land in World War I. If you dare to try to slightly step forward, you will be shot down. And I don't like that. I believe the world is a great place. I don't believe the world is an absolutely black and white place. I believe that there is this thing called nuance, and that there's this thing where people can meet in the middle and agree to certain things, and have some common humanity. And a lot of the problem out of the debates, the arguments, the ridiculous line drawing over the WFAs is it left it so that either you were a Lovecraft apologist or you were a PC police, whatever, and that's just bullshit. I think that's bullshit. I think that does nothing except make us raise our blood pressure. So bear that in mind. I don't want anyone, I hope no one, here's the thing about being a Lovecraft apologist. I've never met a Lovecraft apologist. Likewise, I've never met anybody that is just straight up PC police. You know, like, people sometimes are passionate about things, and that's kind of the bottom line. I am never going to be apologizing for Lovecraft's racism. I can guarantee you that. While I think that there's explanations for, like what we're laying out now, there's not, I mean, there's no sense to apologize for it. It's just simply a fact, that's all. There are reasons for it. I think we're laying the groundwork that there is something to be said for Lovecraft being a product of his time. That doesn't excuse him entirely. That doesn't diminish the depth of some of the horrible things that he said. But it is important to bear that in mind, because to me, and this is one of the reasons why, even though that controversy really made me kind of think twice about doing an Necronomicon 2015, especially to place Lovecraft in such a prominent position. Like, do we really want to do a convention that's about this guy that wrote this fucking poem? But here's the thing, because in my part as the organizer for this, I think of this as not a fan convention, but a literary conference where we can talk about this academically. I think it's important to still put it out there, and we can still have a conference that's 90% about Lovecraft and make it a critical conference. And at times, we can enjoy aspects of it and have a fun time with it, as long as we still keep these things in mind. So, before I completely lose my train of thought, I just want that to be clear. We are not apologizing for Lovecraft's racism, but it's important today to realize that that racism is still an issue. And so maybe what we can do positively, and this is part of the reason why I titled this Moving Past the Howies, is maybe we can positively use what we know and what we discuss about Lovecraft's racism to see how that informs us about America's racism, America's history of racism, and how, thank God, it's changing, but it's still not there entirely. As some background, I'm an immigrant myself. I was born in Denmark and I lived there till I was 5, and then came to the United States after that. I had a little bit of an easier time than I think many other immigrants did. Blonde hair, sort of, and blue eyes makes it probably a little bit easier than other immigrants. But my father was American. He grew up in North Carolina and lived his whole life there until he joined the military about in the 20s. And he was born in 1926, so I was born while he was quite old. But my background to this is my father was very progressive-minded and lived in a family that was relatively very progressive for North Carolina, which means, and probably relatively very progressive for America in general, as Morgan has pointed out. It's not just a Southern thing. But he would get these kind of anecdotes. His parents, who were incredibly well-bred blue bloods, would say, you know, like if somebody would say something about some black kids walking down the street, you know, like call them the N-word. His mom would hit one of the brothers or whatever, and say, "Don't ever talk like that to anybody, not even a black kid." And that "not even" kind of lays the groundwork for the reality of it. And that's something that still exists today. So I hope we can actually use Lovecraft's racism in a positive way to have an open discussion about this. Where we are, where we've come from, where we are. My dad, who died a couple years ago, actually he died on August 20th, which is peculiar, always insisted that things are getting better in this country, because he saw it when it was a lot worse in terms of racial issues. But let's use Lovecraft, let's use Bob Price to remind us that we're not there completely. And anyway, I guess that's enough of a detour. But so I want to back up. Maybe you guys can help me, because all of a sudden I've completely lost my train of thought in my ramble. So are there more thoughts about kind of the background before we kind of move forward into the future?
Well, background on the Howies or the background of Lovecraft's
We'll come back to the Howies. That'll be the second half.
Well, before you beat yourself up too badly, The 23rd, just at the panel that we just had this afternoon, one incredibly positive effect of the 2013 Necronomicon, Anya Martin was sitting right here and said that if it hadn't been for that conference, when it's like helped her find her writer's voice, and she realized that she could write as a woman while still acknowledging everything about Lovecraft, and that in itself is a tribute to what you organized. So.
Yeah, I mean, and in terms of the historical background, there are two levels of background. There is the context of the time that Lovecraft lived in and the way that he reacted to that, and I think that that's not actually as important to this discussion of how to process Lovecraft, is talking about how writers and other artists have processed Lovecraft in his wake, because when we take an influence, we take a whole lot of things, and I suspect a lot of people in this room started reading Lovecraft stories when they were fairly young and maybe fairly naive and not terribly worldly. I know I did, and I remember when I was reading those things, there was some of them, like the horror of Red Dove, that I could say, even at my 12-year-old self, yeah, that's pretty racist. That's awful. What's the problem with these people in this neighborhood and stuff? That can't be right. But the Shadows of Brainsmouth, I mean, the analysis that you can take about miscegenation and whatnot, I just internalized. I thought, yeah, having a baby with a fishman's a gross idea. And the kid's going to turn out awful. He's probably going to turn out, and then I would, and I would internalize it. Probably like my poor friends whose parents took thalidomide. And I would start to think about that. And I would start to think that even though that wasn't exactly what that was, I would start to think about the kind of things that lead you to join the National Socialist Party if there's one around recruiting. And I worked it out, I didn't do any of that. I think I'm a pretty progressive guy, but there was some education from that. And I think one of the issues is when we repeat a lot of these tropes of the strange and red town, which is imaginatively compelling, we also start to talk about eugenics, whether we know it or not. And at some point you start to think rationally that maybe it does make sense that the bottom 5%, based on some measure, ought to be. And you move away from these things. And so I think one of the things that's very important when we look at these things is kind of understand what they're about. And as creators and artists, think about how to take the anxieties that Lovecraft brought up, and he was very good at, and address them in a modern and dare I say, more progressive way.
The reason why my research is on eugenics and Lovecraft and not eugenics and some other writer of fantastic fiction is because Lovecraft really expresses his fears of his eugenics fears and his race fears much more poignantly than anybody else I could find at that time period working in this fantastic genre. And so even though there are samples of a lot of racial fears in a lot of Weird Tales issues where you get a evil yellow man, the yellow peril on the cover, an evil Asian man, nobody does it quite as much as Lovecraft. It's a nervous tick that keeps coming by. For example, Henry James has a lot of fears of racism. There are paragraphs in his private letters in which he's talking about hordes of, immigrants invading New York. But when you read Henry James, that is not put on the page in that way that Lovecraft does it. And in literature, there's also a lot, and in movies and public culture, there's a lot of racial and eugenicist concerns, but they're not quite as pointed as Lovecraft does it. And there's one other writer, and he is writing not fantastic fiction, but realist literature, who does go, I would say, who is the equivalent of Lovecraft, but in literary fiction, and he's Eugene Caswell, and he writes God's Little Acre, and several other ones, but he's focusing on basically the hillbillies, the white trash people, and he's writing all these books where you see how they are the form and poor of spirit, spiritually, they're not right. Yeah, Erskine Caldwell. And so there's this one guy who's doing kind of the same thing that Lovecraft is doing, but he's doing it in the literary realist venue. And then there's Lovecraft, he's doing it in the fantastic. And I haven't found anybody else really that is doing it quite so pointedly like they do. and certainly Lovecraft is the only one that's doing it like this in fantastic fiction. So that's why, even though we are giving you, I think, a context, a historical context of what it was like, he is interesting to analyze because it is very prevalent in his short fiction. So it's not just his private letters like Henry James, where if you have never read his private letters, you would probably never know that he was, he had a lot of trouble with immigrants. It's right there on the page, and it's being woven into a narrative, and it's taking another shape. And that's why I think, when you consider the context, you also have to consider that literary context, that nobody's quite doing it as much as he is, at least from all the research I've done.
I brought some stuff to read because I'm not an expert, but I found some stuff. I had occasion recently to do some research, which I stumbled onto a thing, and if you don't mind, I'm going to read it, please. And I'm going to read it now because we're making this conversation up as we go, and I don't know if there'll be a better opportunity later. But it was written in 1906, so it's part of the historical background. Race prejudice is an attitude of mind which precludes the exercise of reason. It lifts up its voice only to rave. It is no new phenomenon, but as old as human folly, of which it is so conspicuous an example. Being wholly emotional, it expresses itself mainly by means of hysterical ejaculations. Its fruits, as will later be seen, range from burlesque fears of imaginary contamination to the foulest massacres that have stained the pages of history. It is the offshoot of so obviously childish a vanity that the one amazing fact in the whole controversy is to find it seriously defended by any civilized man. It is simply an extension of the subconscious feeling of the average man that the whole of the universe revolves around him and was created for his especial benefit. Podsnappery is but a phase of this abnormal conceit. The existence of race prejudice among presumably civilized peoples is a lamentable demonstration of the general deficiency of mental training. The intense prejudice against the Jew in Russia, the Negro in one part of America, the Indian in another, and the Chinaman in still another is merely an exaggeration of the jingo patriotism, which renders the braggarts of every nation the object of pitying contempt by the equally boastful patriots of every other nation. The average man of any country is firmly persuaded first that he belongs to the highest race on the planet, next that his particular country is the best and most glorious in the world, and finally that the class or caste to which he belongs is the most important and indispensable in society. And these various forms of conceit are sedulously fostered by association with those as possessed of them as himself. That was written in 1906 by James F. Morton, who was one of H.P. Lovecraft's best friends.
Yeah, if you ever read Letters to Morton, which collects all of his letters, there couldn't be two more different people. And even though Morton is trying to, talk about, this, in trying to tell Lovecraft, the science that you're using is not making sense, we're just not seeing this properly, Lovecraft never really changes his mind. But yeah, Morton was really progressive. Yeah.
That's actually an interesting thing. One of the things that's fascinating to me about Lovecraft, and again, because I have this sort of almost obsession with nuance and gray, is how right he was about some things. Like his views of the cosmos, for example, are ones that, I said this the other day on the science panel, you could take some lines from Lovecraft and, quotes from Lovecraft and put Neil deGrasse Tyson's name underneath, and it would be pretty true, There is this fun game on the web you can find called Lovecraft or Hitler, where the quote is, guess which one, and it's disturbingly more difficult than you hope, but I think you can do the same thing with Lovecraft or Neil deGrasse Tyson, which I would find far more entertaining and less miserable. So to me, and also I think it's funny, I feel like right before the Howie Awards thing really blew up and this poem really started getting passed around, it was I think the previous election cycle, and all of a sudden, people, it's almost like the Bible. You find examples of texts that you agree that match up with your beliefs, and so you share those, and you ignore the ones that you don't agree with or whatever. There were quotes from Lovecraft disparaging of Republicans, which was a popular thing that bounced around. Everyone's embracing that. Oh my God, Lovecraft he's so right. And then we all find out, he's a racist, and okay, so all of a sudden those other positive things stop getting shared. Sorry.
His She was a social. Well, yeah, she ended up saying the New Deal is a great idea.
Well, so that's the funny thing is, I mean, so we know, just to save some time, we'll skip. I mean, we know that on some things, his views really changed and modified. He went from being a monarchist to practically being a socialist. It's remarkable. And yet, I'm just like, God damn it, why did you have to, why couldn't you, I mean, so maybe if he'd lived a proper age, maybe if he ate a good diet and not eaten cans of beans his whole life, maybe he would have lived long enough and interacted enough with people who could have changed his mind on things. He clearly was a smart person who thought outside the box on a lot of things, and yet on this one topic, he thought like the majority of sons of bitches around him. Morgan can tell you about articles in the Providence Journal that were being written about immigrants and how wretched they were. That was this thing that was being bombarded. And yet, it's frustrating in so many ways. Lovecraft didn't think like everybody else, but in this one way, damn it, he did. And it's just astonishing to me that, you know, I mean, people will say, oh, well, he was modifying his views in life. And, oh, he was, you know, he married to a Jew and he had, you know, a couple of friends that were progressive. Yes, and that's true about almost any racist you'll find. They're hypocrites. You know, very often they're hypocrites. They are contrary to their own beliefs very often, you know. The frustrating thing is Lovecraft was smart enough to get past that, and he doesn't seem like he did as much as we wanted him to. But anyway, blah, blah, blah. Okay. I want to kind of move forward a little bit because we have maybe 20-ish minutes, and really move this forward. I'm sorry to belabor the point, but I want to think and have our panel talk about what it is that we can do to move the weird fiction community forward, and make it so that the faces in here, in this room, and on this panel aren't all generally people that are of European descent, that are people that are from other parts of the world, because Europe and very small parts of North America is a really small part of the land masses on this planet. And the other thing is, how many of you have seen Anne and Jeff Vandermeer's collection, The Weird? That's not nearly enough hands. But those of you need to go out and get this book. It's this frickin' thick. Like you'd hurt yourself if you dropped it on your foot. And bless them for putting it together, because it's got authors from around the world in it. It's got Haruki Murakami for one thing in it. I mean, it shows you what weird fiction truly is today. And that isn't just old white guys writing stories anymore. And the future of weird fiction, not what it is today, but the future of weird fiction is definitely not going to be just old white guys. And don't get me wrong, old white guys write some great weird fiction. But for me, the interesting thing is I want to hear other people's voices. I want to hear African storytellers tell weird tales. Japanese storytellers tell weird tales. You know, people from the Pacific Islands I bet they tell some hell of a good weird tales. And I want the next Necronomicon, if there is a next Necronomicon, if I live through this weekend, to have more diversity. I want that to be something that we can all think about, how we can make that happen, because it is the only way that there are going to be more events like this, and that there's going to be a future where it's not just stale old rehashing of pastiche. And thank goodness for a few people on this panel who are contributing to making sure that it's not just stale old pastiche, but exciting, engaging, new fiction from new voices. So I want to sort of have that be kind of the next phase is, how can we move past the house? How can we move and accept Lovecraft, accept where we are now, and then move forward in a positive way that brings many voices in? So I'd like to put that out.
I think one of the awkward problems that you have with that is that Lovecraft himself has become quite popular right now.
Yes.
We go down to the dealer's room, and there are people making a good living and doing little Cthulhu's and little Howard Lovecraft statues and whatnot. And there are shirts, and there are and there's this role-playing game that everybody's playing. So we've almost turned pop culture attention to this one dude who is telling the kind of story that a lot of other dudes and women too are telling. And because we filter everything through the Cthulhu mythos and through, if it's a bad book, it's probably the Necronomicon, which, by the way, was written by that era, and so on. We force ourselves to confront and deal with this crap regularly. Sometimes when the story might not relevantly be wanting to take a look at the problematic matter, which to me is the really responsible way to look at Lovecraft, is to dig into what's problematic and go after it. So I think the trick is actually things like the weird anthology that and things like the last season of True Detective, which went straight to changes, and looking at some other antecedents as well that people might find interesting, to get that same kind of sense of cosmic awe that Lovecraft was so very good at bringing forward. So I just basically, anybody editing an anthology out there, try not to call it the Cthulhu Cookbook or something. No, that's what they said.
Right now. Yeah, so I guess Lovecraft can serve as a starting point for a lot of people, and kind of you can expand into weird fiction a little bit longer. So weird fiction is broader than Lovecraft, so if people come in for the Lovecraft but they stay for the weird fiction, I think that would be nice. And there's a lot of weird fiction that it's very varied, and it comes from all kinds of different backgrounds. So you can say that something like Uzumaki, which is Japanese, is a really good manga. It's weird fiction because really strange things go on. And if you haven't read it, you should. It has things that I think any Lovecraftian person would appreciate. It doesn't have, the mythos in the sense that there's no Asathoth or Nyarlathotep, but it's about an obsession with spirals. People in a town becoming obsessed and overtaken by spirals in many different ways. And so if you read this and you like Lovecraft, I think you quite enjoy that. And there's many other works that I feel would fall in that category, whether they're new or they're older. There's a new collection. There's several new collections by a lot of wonderful people, but there's a new Shirley Jackson collection of some material that just appeared. And so Shirley Jackson sometimes does, weird fiction in some of her work. The Lottery is probably her most famous short story. And there are other people. I'm forgetting, there was this Japanese woman, and I'm forgetting her name. She had a collection 2 years ago, and it was excellent. I'll probably remember after I stop talking, but the stories were all interlinked. So one character would reappear in another story, or one element would reappear in another story. And Revenge is the name of the collection. And it got reviewed in the New York Times and the Guardian, very, very nice places to get reviewed. And it has this element of weirdness, not in the sense, again, of Cthulhu mythos, but just in, normality is shattered, and suddenly something strange goes on, but it's more from a psychological perspective. So in that sense, I think I like the plushies, but and the role-playing games are cute and all that. But if you look at weird as a broader term, we can maybe expand and look at a lot more stuff than if we just focus on things that only have Cthulhu on them, and then nothing else counts. I think there's quite a bit of stuff that is in the spirit of Lovecraft and the spirit of weird fiction, but it doesn't necessarily have those flashy mythos elements. But even without the flashy mythos elements, you can enjoy a lot of pretty bleak and really interesting fiction.
Well, speaking of your accomplishments, Niels, it is ironic that you have gotten Lovecraft the respect in his own city that the earlier World Fantasy Cons and Necronomicons did not. And so at this very time when you've made Lovecraft ring throughout the city, that you should also be worrying about the racism problem. It's extremely ironic. But there's no doubt, earlier today on the tentacles, on the oh no more tentacles panel, the artists Jason Eckhart particularly was expressing, we're kind of unhappy that everybody in the world loves Lovecraft. It was was not that we don't like the plushies of the games, but we liked it better when he was ours, when he was just ours. And there is no doubt that that remains a strong sentiment, and that's part of what came out when his figure on the World Fantasy Awards was challenged. You're challenging ours.
So I just feel I'm so out of left field for everybody else, so I apologize for that. But I think we deal with this a lot in museums. How we change our audiences, how we change our staff, our boards. This is not a problem solely among a conference like this. And there aren't any, I think, really great, quick answers to it, though I think that one of the pieces that shouldn't be missed is the educational aspect that's available in terms of really not just talking to ourselves about this problem, but talking to other people in our communities about it, like teachers, school librarians, people who have access to kids from different backgrounds and who are showing an interest in reading. I mean, I hate to be that basic about it, but some of this is about reading and who's reading for pleasure and who's reading for fun, and what teachers and librarians are thinking of as literature that's worth reading. And so, while maybe it didn't take it away as a secret love of a small group of folks, it is now in a place of literary recognition that I think, if used correctly, and not just can be a springboard into these conversations of what else, because again, is it somebody who reads this and doesn't just jump into the weird and fantasy, but they love the Gothic? And what about the folks who move into magical realism and South American work, or North African literature that often has a very mystical quality to it? So if we start seeing it not just as a genre that automatically moves into one category, but realize that this is an entry point and a doorway into something that's going to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And be okay with that. Because quite frankly, to me, it's about, just not that's the absolute pleasure of reading, but we have to read, we have to think critically. And that's what all of this is about. Whether we understand it when we're 12 or we understand it differently when we're 14. I mean, I read Huck Finn about 7 or 8 times. And I read it the first time when I was 10 years old, and I didn't understand it. And then I read it in high school, and I thought I understood it. And in college, I really thought I understood it. And then I taught it a few times, and shit, like, I'm never going to understand it. But I think that it is creating that space where we realize that it is literature. And the people who write these stories are going to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and how do we open up a space for that? And is there a space in Necronomicon for Borges? Is there a space for David Nickle? Is there a space for Nejma? And for people to come together and really say, as thinking people, I want to see how these things intersect. So.
I had a beautiful thought for a second, and it's just spaced out on me. But for the radio listening audience. All right. Well, no, we're not time for questions yet. Thank goodness for that. I think this is kind of the fascinating thing, is the problem of being faced with the dilemma. Either you can't like Lovecraft, or if you do like Lovecraft, you have to say that you're, somehow condoning racism or something like that. The fascinating thing to me, some of you may have read this really remarkably well-written blog that really kind of kicked off a lot of the debate about Lovecraft's racism a year and a half, 2 years ago. I'm blanking on the name of the guy who wrote it, but it's particularly talking about the bronze bust that we put in, that we were primary force to get placed over the Athenaeum. And the author of the blog really played up a lot on Lovecraft's racism. He put that poem in there. That's where I first really read it, was in there. And the blog was absolutely perfect, actually. I was just like, you know, apart from getting over the visceral gut blow of reading that poem, he nailed it until the very end. And he said this comment. He said, what the plaque actually should say on it is, HP Lovecraft, wretched racist, also wrote books. And the problem with that is that bronze bust wasn't put there because he's a wretched racist. The reason we're in this room is not because he was a wretched racist or whatever it was phrased. It was because he also wrote books. I think the important thing is that monuments to Lovecraft are legitimate, but they should say Lovecraft wrote amazing fiction that inspired us to write more fiction around the world, people, fans from around the world, to be inspired by it and moved by it. And even if you don't think it's the best prose ever, there's something to it that catches probably most of us, if not all of us in this room. And then parenthetically, by the way, he was really kind of a fucked up guy. That's okay, that's okay. Maybe not, I wouldn't phrase it quite that way. Yeah, probably not in black. But, oh, by the way, he was a flawed human being. Oh, by the way, yeah, he really had some awful thoughts about other people.
Well, we'll have to put that plaque on everybody's statue.
Well, that's the thing. That's what I'm trying to say. Is he was a human, and to me, the beauty of humans sometimes is they make stupid mistakes and think stupid things, and sometimes until they die. But the reason that we make Lovecraft busts, and the reason that we sell Cthulhu plushies, is because we admire the writing, not because we admire this flawed aspect of Lovecraft, of this one person. So that's my one problem with that otherwise really good blog post. And an interesting thing, I went to a great, one of the reasons that we have this panel, I went to a great sort of fan-based conference up in Boston called Aricia, which is phenomenal. It's one of the very few times I've actually just gone to a convention just to enjoy it. And it's very amazingly grassroots, very democratic, very fan-based, amazing convention. And one of the panels was called Lovecraft Racism and something like that. And there was a number of amazing authors and bloggers and stuff on it, including Daniel Jose Older, who was the guy that started the campaign, the signature campaign against the Howard, essentially the war, the WFA war. And I had a great chance to talk to him afterwards, and we had a really good talk. And I was actually kind of hoping to get him to come here, but for some reason he felt like maybe he would be totally welcome. But one of the interesting things he said on the panel was the whole panel was basically really laying into Lovecraft, and rightly so. One of the things he said towards the end was he was very excited about this project that he was working on, which was going to be a graphic novel that he described as, he said, I'm working on this great Lovecraftian graphic novel. And I was just like, wow, wait a second, that's kind of awesome. Here's this guy who is more than anybody pointing out what a racist son of a bitch Lovecraft was, but at the same time acknowledging that Lovecraft was still an inspiration. And to me, that was an important thing to see.
I published Daniel when he was starting out in his Mount magazine.
Oh, good.
So if you want to figure that one out. Then he went on to do a lot of novels and be very successful. But just a couple of things. One is that you keep mentioning that poem, and people keep mentioning it, and I'm just like, did nobody else read all of his letters? Because I have, and doing my research, I think it's 15 pages single-spaced of racist quotes from Lovecraft. So about 12,000 words now. Just and people keep going back to that. Oh, he said much more elaborate things on the topic, and people keep going back to that one. Oh, don't worry, he didn't just hate black people. He hated Asians. He hated everybody. Yeah, I mean. Yeah,
I certainly don't mean to.
Tibet people.
Yeah, and that's a tough one we talked about here. So you mentioned it, the Quebec class in Rhode Island, in particular, in who come down with to take part in industry, and Rhode Island is Woonsocket, when Lovecraft was a young man, is the second largest French-speaking city in North America. And so there is an incredible presence of French Canadians here, and an interesting thing happens. Many of you probably have seen where cartoonists and people doing caricatures in the 19th century would racialize the Irish as African American. The same thing happens here, where the French Canadians are racialized as Chinese. And so they're racialized as Chinese in the 1880s. So 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act, our first immigration law that bars a particular group of people. And so the French Canadians here are referred to as the heathen Chinese of the East, the yellow plague of the East. They are hated here, and that is something that he is deeply involved in. So it's very local for him. So it's not just sort of like he went up for a visit. This is a big population in Rhode Island.
And just one other thing, so you will hate him even more now. He talked about gay people. The first time he met homosexual people, his quote was, "I didn't know whether to kiss it or kill it." So nobody has picked that one, but I keep waiting for somebody to do that. Like, he also hated gay people.
But some of his best friends were gay.
Some were gay. But the other thing is, I think that's the sentiment that's so interesting about Lovecraft. He doesn't know whether to kiss it or kill it. He's torn between desire and repulsion in his stories, and that's why they're so meaty in a literary sense. And so that's why I love looking at him that way. And so in that sense, I don't think I think you can appreciate that and still be like, you probably don't want to go kill any people right now. I'm assuming you're all very sensible people, but you can appreciate how literary that desire and objection is being transposed there. One thing that I find problematic is that sometimes when people reject Lovecraft's ideology, they also want to reject his prose. So they say, well, he was racist, therefore he was a bad writer. And the problem is that he was actually a really good writer, and he was also racist. But our desire is that if something is unpalatable in one area, it should be completely dismissed. And I can see why that happens when somebody is alive, because if somebody right now is, for example, fundraising to destroy all Mexicans, I'm probably not going to buy their book and support them, because they're deriving like an income from that. Lovecraft is dead, just like Lord Byron, who was really scuzzy in other ways, and a lot of other people who were really problematic in other ways. It's like studying him and everything like that is a lot easier for me because he is a dead white guy, and I might feel differently if he was alive. And like I said, he was, talking about exterminating people that look like me, and maybe using the money to support causes like that. I might not buy his books, but he's safely dead. He died a long time ago, and I think we can all calmly discuss his work in a variety of ways, not start panicking, which happens a lot. That was the other thing that happened. We want to change the bus. Oh my God, it's almost like we wanted to take Lovecraft out of his grave and pee on him, just because we started talking about changing the bus. Nobody had said we're going to change it tomorrow. It was just a conversation, and some people started panicking. And it's like, we can have conversations about stuff that's complex and complicated, and that doesn't mean we're going to destroy all the fun in the world. Like, we won't confiscate the Cthulhu plushies.
We really, for the Howies, talk about separating things and stopping the panic. We really need to separate the Gad Wilson cartoon bust of Lovecraft that forms the Howie statuette from the discussion of Lovecraft as a racist. That there's the question of, does the face of any author belong on this award, which is supposed to be honoring excellence in fantasy or horror, when most of the other awards are abstract. The Hugo Gernsback, not a wonderful person either. His name is on the Hugos, but it's a rocket ship. It's not a picture of Hugo Gernsback. The Bram Stoker Award is not actually a picture of Bram Stoker. But this is the appropriate place to mention that it was 40 years ago in this room, the first World Fantasy Con. It's kind of a historical accident. Dan Wilson was one of the organizers of that convention. It was mostly a horror-oriented convention, even though it was called the World Fantasy Convention. The organizers were all from the field of weird fiction, really, and that's why Lovecraft's bust is because it was in Providence, and they were Lovecraft fans and part of the Lovecraft circle.
Yeah, if it had been in some other place, we might have, like, you know, the Robert J. Sawyer, if it had been years later, award, his face in the award had been in Canada in 1995.
Think about that. But I mean, the other thing with the World Fantasy Award to remember is that Dan Wilson is still alive and elderly and donated this thing.
Yes.
And I suspect that a lot of people who had been involved with that at the time are loath simply to hurt the old man's feelings. So that's the kind of thing we don't want to bring up too much in the discussion of it because it sounds condescending, and I guess that's me being condescending right now. But there is the fact that in addition to this being a big cultural award, it's also the product of the volunteer work of people who came forward in good faith and came forward with a hate. I mean, I suspect that 20 years down the road, or even later when Mr. Wilson passes on, it'll be an easier discussion to have because it won't have that.
I think there may be people here who aren't familiar with the history with the World Fantasy, or could you just give a quick rundown of what you've been talking about for those folks?
It sounds like you wanted to, yeah.
Daniel Jose Older, who was mentioned, that Niels mentioned here, wrote a proposal that was widely distributed online. It had so much coverage, it was even in the Guardian newspaper. This was last summer. Seriously proposing that he and several other writers of color felt offended that to receive an award with Lovecraft's likeness on it. The writer Nydia Corafor, for instance, said that she particularly hated having won this award because of Lovecraft's racism. So Daniel Jose Older's first proposition was to replace his image with the image of the writer Octavia Butler. And many people, so there were a lot of responses. St. Joshi wrote a long response, and Jose Older wrote a response to the response. And the matter has been taken under advisement by the officials of the World Fantasy Convention. This year's award is unchanged. I haven't been able to get an update as to what they're thinking of for 2016.
But I think suffice it to say that very quickly the battle lines were drawn that I sort of intimated before, where either you were on the one camp where you were a complete apologist for somebody who was A, and inseparably A, terrible writer, and B, a terrible racist. And that very quickly became one side, which I'll just say, I mean, St. Joshi was sort of placed as the figurehead for that, and he sort of placed himself there to some extent as a defender of not the racism so much, but obviously St. is going to defend the fighting. And then on the other side, Daniel Jose Older, who was giving this trenchant argument that he's not only a terrible racist, but also a terrible writer. And naturally, for Lovecraft fans to have that's the proposal, you have to accept that not only is he a terrible racist, but he's also equally a terrible writer. And I think the one mistake that Daniel Jose Older did was to inextricably link those two things together. And that, obviously, terrible writing is, as St. Joshi sometimes is not aware of, is very subjective, or writing capacity is a very subjective thing. So, otherwise, I think that, there was a lot of room for middle ground that was just very quickly cleared out. And either you were far to one side, that the how we had to be taken away, etc., vanished, Lovecraft stricken from the record of history books, or you were on the other side where, you thought absolutely. Anyway, we've already kind of explained it, but yeah, very quickly the lines became drawn, and it's only recently, I think in the past 6 months or so, that things have really kind of come back, where people can see, oh, you know what, the dust has settled, the trolls on both sides had their say, And we're realizing that there is room for saying, yes, he was a racist, and yes, he actually wrote stories that I really enjoy, you know. But anyway, so I think at this point, we should really open up if anyone else has a few more questions that we can ask. Yes, you. Yes, you.
So I just wanted to say that for not wanting to be apologists, you've been apologizing an awful lot. And as a Latino person, I can totally understand being offended by something, and then also understanding that it's good writing. I've dealt with that a lot. I get it. But, you know, you kind of mocked Jose a little bit, which was offensive. And you haven't told me what you're actually going to do. I've been here all day and have, you know, had a lot of white people talking about things, and you know, Silvia, I think, is the first person of color, maybe besides SU, I've seen here. But I think, you know, I don't see you doing anything. I see you talking about it, but I want to know what you're actually going to do.
And so, I thank you. I certainly didn't mean to mock Daniel Jose Older. Like I said, I actually was really impressed with what he said and enjoyed it tremendously. One thing that I was saying about him is that it's important to realize that even the people that critique Lovecraft to that extent also acknowledge that there is something about Lovecraft that's engaging. And as to your second point, that's exactly right. I have some things that we're working on right now. We've been actively engaging with writers and artists that are people of color to join us and to make sure that one of the things I realized as an organizer is this doesn't just automatically happen. We don't just open the door and that's it. It takes effort, and we've learned that lesson somewhat late, but we're learning it. And so one of the reasons that I wanted this panel is to open the door and ask people, what is it that we should be doing? I don't know the answers completely, but I know that something has to be done about it. So I'd love to hear from people if they have suggestions for how it is that we can make this more of a diverse thing. And one thing I'll say that we have already been actively engaged in talking with some amazing people like Cheshire Burke and Craig Gidney, who want to come and join us, and we're almost able to come this time, and plan to join us in 2017. And I fully admit that we haven't done enough, but that's something we want to change. I'm happy to talk to you about that.
I guess in a broader way, all of my anthologies have featured people of color. In my latest anthology, She Walks in Shadows, which is all women has, I think 7 women of color from very different backgrounds. I translated one story from Spanish into English, and I have translated several stories from Spanish into English into all my anthologies. So that's just my effort. I like to reach out, and it's hard because when I ask somebody to write me a Lovecraftian story who hasn't done it before and they're a person of color, the first thing they tell me is he was a racist, and no. But then I tell them that if they want to change the space, they need to help me by expressing their thoughts and their voices and telling me how they would tell the story. And like I say, in this broader, weird context, and whether they want to use straw guts or not, it's up to them. Some people have taken me up on it, and so that's really great. And I keep asking people, and like I say, some people are surprised. Like Nadia Balkan, who's the first time she wrote this story set in Indonesia, she told me the first time, I don't know if I can do this, and then she did, and then she wrote several more, and she's been in several anthologies. So from a personal perspective, it's wanting to do it, it's having the willpower of actually sitting down and making a list of people who I know are good writers and saying, would you like to participate in this? But it can't just be me. I think it needs to be a broader thing where people in general take up that call to try to work a little bit harder to get to know women and more women writers and more people of color, and think, well, maybe this person hasn't done anything Lovecraftian, but I like the Gothic story. They were really good, or the literary story, which I think they might be good partners of this, and then something good can happen. And I'm excited that Daniel wants to do something, a comic, and I think he wants to do maybe an Afro-Caribbean protagonist for his Lovecraft comic. I think that would be great and very interesting to see what he comes up with in his vision. But it can't just be Daniel and me and just all of us kind of sitting. Everybody I think if anybody is an editor or a publisher or is organizing a convention, you should really take in the back of your head not just, this was an interesting conversation, but maybe who can I invite that I haven't thought about inviting before that can bring maybe a different or interesting point of view. And I know sometimes it's hard to think about that and people have different schedules and all that, but I think if you really try, we will get into a much better place. Like, they brought me this year and I don't think they knew if I was going to come and I said I would, and I hope more people come next year who are doing weird writing and stuff like that, and women, and Livia Lewin and Shesa Berg and other people, and they come and they're here, and that would be great. That would be great. But really, if you are organizing like a fan thing or anything like that, try to think who might I bring that is not in my first top 5 names that come to my mind. Who else might I bring? And work a little bit harder. I know it's work, but it can be done. I mean, I got 7 women of color for one apology.
Yeah, I think as a Caucasian writer who is interested in weird fiction, what I've tried to do is, frankly, check my privilege, to be aware of the fact that I'm coming from this perspective, and that there are traps of assumptions that I can fall into as a writer. So when I did Utopia, I was very conscious of the fact that I wanted to write a very critical novel about the eugenics movement and about Lovecraft's ideas, and put that foremost in mind, so that I wouldn't be adding another novel by a white guy from Toronto that trampled over all of the diversity of character and experience that could be. And I think that's the thing that an artist can do, is try and move beyond themselves.
This isn't a direct answer to the question, but one of the reasons I wanted to participate in the panel, and hope that Niels would let me, is that one of the things I struggle with is how to be a friend of Lovecraft. And I took comfort from knowing that Lovecraft had friends who were obviously not racist. In fact, James F. Morgan, was on committees on the NAACP. He was the very opposite of a racist. And so I know it's possible to like Lovecraft and overlook some of the more repellent aspects of some of the things he thought about. So it's easy as a white guy to, you don't really feel the sting of some of this stuff. But as a gay man, I also, I more feel sorry for him than spend a lot of time being offended. I just, he had his limitations, and I appreciate the stuff about him that was good, and there's a whole lot of talk about apology. I'm not apologizing for him either, but at the same time, I'm choosing to see the good side and not take personally the stuff that he was too stupid to know better about.
Yeah, that's the thing is I don't think he was too stupid. I think he just was really wrong. But anyway, again, I completely accept the fact that I don't know what we're doing yet. I just know that we need to do something. And so I offer that commitment that we are going to put effort into it. And I really want people to help us with that. That's the one thing I can say is that it can't be just a few of us. It actually takes work to do this. And this is something that I'm completely committed to. Like I said, if there's going to be a 2017, it's going to be a different 2017. It's going to be a different convention than it is now. Otherwise, it's probably not going to happen. Yes?
So I was kind of looking to ask you to maybe address, how would you kind of address something with the fact that positive attention on like this being preventative for some people, some diverse background acts to come and go away with certain things, keeping in mind that the money is on like this kind of
Yeah, that honestly is something that I've thought about. Obviously that's, a class question. It's difficult to have a convention where you want it to be open to everybody of all backgrounds, including poor people who, obviously in this country very commonly are people of color. I don't know what the good answer is. One of the things that we've tried to do is open up a lot of opportunities for volunteering at the convention, to open up that work, and that's done something, but really the bigger thing is sort of just engagement, making it be known that this is a place where all people are welcome, and where some things that have been said sometimes aren't things that are actually anything we ever adhere to as an organization. But yeah, I mean, that is something that we've thought about. Unfortunately, the pricing that we have is frustratingly very much the bare minimum for the expenses that we're putting into it. Yes?
The fact is, if you look at Lovecraft's letters, in my opinion, most of his friends and correspondents were his intellectual inferiors, despite the fact that some of them were intelligent, some of them were creative. Isn't that an unconscious strategy for keeping his opinions safe? That he never dealt with people who were above him? It's sort of like only watching Fox News.
Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
I don't think that, unfortunately, in this period, people who were his, or could be perceived as his intellectual or academic superiors were necessarily more progressive than he in this area. So I think that's unfortunate. I think that this kind of attitude, while I certainly think what you're saying, I mean, I think he crossed all lines, and intellect was not in any way a barrier. It was something else.
Have a question in the far back? Oh, what was your question?
So it was more of a point. We were discussing.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. We should wrap up really quickly.
So really quickly, we were discussing how the future of weird fiction can roll forward. It occurred to me that it's happening right under our nose.
Yeah.
Specifically, I'd like to point to the Welcome to Night Vale podcast, put forward by Joseph Fink, who actively hates Lovecraft, even though he edited an anthology of work inspired by Lovecraft. But there's a diversity of characters. It's definitely weird fiction.
But that's the thing. I mean, I just really quickly interrupt. I think the change in weird fiction, exactly as his point, the change in weird fiction is happening. The diversification of voices in weird fiction is happening. Whether we want it to happen or not, whether Bob Price wants it to happen or not, it's happening.
And by the way, I'm not saying that that's enough.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's not exactly.
That's not to exonerate.
Until I see a room where there is actually sort of something like a representative cross-section of America, it's not enough. I think, unfortunately, we are really over time. I'm very sorry. I really appreciate it. Thank you all.